The second time I sent money to the man who robbed me, there were people from a federal fraud unit watching the screen as I did it. I need you to sit with that for a moment, because it is the hinge the whole story swings on. 3 weeks earlier, the first time, I had been alone and grieving and so lonely I could not see straight, and I had handed a criminal $11,000, every cent I had set aside for my dead wife's headstone, and I had let him take it. I knew better. I had spent 40 years of my life knowing better, and I let him take it anyway. This time was different. This time I knew exactly who was on the other end of that screen. This time the money was bait, and the account I was sending it to was a hook I had spent 4 decades learning how to set. This time I wanted them to take it. So how does a man who hunted fraud his entire working life end up robbed of the one thing he swore he would never spend? And what does that same man do once the grief finally lets go of his throat and 40 years of training, stand up in the dark, and get back to work? That is the whole story. And it does not start with a crime. It starts with a quiet I could not stand. My wife's name was Eleanor. We were married 41 years. She was the kind of woman who noticed the things the rest of us walked straight past. The first warm Sunday of every spring she would make me drive her out to the old county road where the dogwoods grew wild along the fence line, and she would stand there in the gravel with her hand shading her eyes and just look at them. White blossoms, 4 petals each, every one of them notched at the tip like something had taken a small, careful bite. She sketched them on whatever paper was in her purse receipts, mostly the back of a grocery receipt with a dogwood drawn on it in blue pen. After she passed, I found dozens of them tucked into books, pressed flat between the pages of her Bible. She died on a Tuesday in February. The house got very large and very quiet after that. I am not too proud to tell you what those first months were like. A man can spend his whole life reading people, can spot a liar across a crowded room and still come home to an empty kitchen and not know what to do with his own 2 hands. I cooked for 2 out of habit and scraped half of it into the trash. I turned to say something to her and found only the wall. The loneliness was not loud. It was a low, constant hum. Like a refrigerator you stop hearing until the night it finally stops, and the silence wakes you out of a dead sleep. It was in that quiet that the message came. It arrived on one of those community pages, the kind where people post about lost cats and church bake sales. A kind word under a photo I had shared of the dogwoods on Eleanor's road. A woman named Claire. She said the blossoms reminded her of her grandmother's yard. She said she was sorry for whatever sadness she could feel behind my words. Now, I have to be honest with you, because if I am not honest, this whole story is worthless. I knew. By the 3rd message, maybe the 4th, a part of me knew. The pacing was too smooth. The interest was too total. She mirrored me the way they are trained to mirror, I liked a thing, so she loved that thing too. I named a hope. And she had carried that same hope all her life. I had read transcripts exactly like ours in case files going back decades. I could have written her next line before it arrived. And I let it happen anyway. That is the part nobody tells you about. Everyone believes the people who fall for these things are foolish, or greedy, or simply do not know any better. Some don't. But some of us know precisely what is happening and let it continue. Because the lie is warm, and the truth is a cold house and a stack of dogwood sketches you cannot bring yourself to throw away. I told myself I was watching her, studying her, the old investigator running a long, patient surveillance. But you cannot put loneliness under surveillance. It surveils you. We talked for 6 weeks before she ever mentioned money. That is the first thing people get wrong. They imagine a scammer asks on the first day. The good ones never do. They spend weeks building something that feels more real than your real life, until the asking, when it comes, feels less like a request and more like a kindness you are grateful to be allowed to give. When the first ask came, It was small, and it was clever, and it was wrapped in a story so human I almost admired the craft of it. A coworker of hers, a single mother, had her account frozen over some bureaucratic mix-up, and the woman's little boy needed a prescription filled by Friday. Could Claire trouble me? She hated to ask. She had never asked anyone for anything in her life for a gift card. $200. She would pay it back the moment her own funds cleared. I knew what a gift card request was. There is no honest reason on this earth that a person you have never met in the flesh needs you to read them the numbers off the back of a gift card. It is the oldest tell in the modern book. Untraceable, irreversible, gone the second you speak the digits aloud. I bought the card. I read her the numbers, and I sat in my truck in the store parking lot afterward, ashamed in a way I had not felt in years, because I had testified against men for facilitating that exact transaction, and there I was, willing doing it to myself. Why? You are asking why. I have asked myself the same thing 1,000 times since. The closest I can come is this. She said good night to me. Every night. For the first time in months, the house was not entirely silent, and $200 felt like a fair price for a voice in the dark, even a voice I half suspected was reading from a page. But a man can only lie to himself for so long, even a man who badly wants to. The asks grew, the way they always grow. A phone she needed replaced so we could keep talking. A small fee on a package she swore she was sending me. Each one a little larger than the last, each one stitched to a story a little more urgent. And each time, some buried part of me filed it away the escalation curve, the manufactured emergencies. The way she would go quiet and wounded if I hesitated, so that paying her felt like an apology I owed. Then came the morning that took the headstone money. And I have to slow down here, because this is where everything turned, and it does not deserve to be rushed. Eleanor had been in the ground more than a year by then, with nothing but a small temporary marker over her, a flat aluminum plate with her name stamped into it, the kind the funeral home leaves you while you decide. I had been saving for the real stone. Granite, with a dogwood carved into the corner. I kept the drawing folded in my wallet. $11,000, set aside in its own account, untouched, because that money was hers, and I would sooner have gone hungry than spend it on anything else in this world. That morning Claire told me she was in trouble, real trouble. There had been an accident, a hospital in another country, fees that had to be paid before they would even treat her, and she was frightened, and there was no one else, and she was so sorry to bring this to me. And then she said the thing. She said it gently, the way a knife goes in gently, so that it is already deep before you feel it. She said, Eleanor would want you to help me. Eleanor would want you to live again. She used my dead wife's name. Weeks before, she had asked me what flower Eleanor loved, said she wanted to plant one, so she could feel closer to the woman who had made me who I was. And I had told her. The dogwood. I told her about the receipts, the blue pen, the notched white petals. I handed her the most tender thing I owned, and that morning she picked it up and used it as a crowbar to pry open the one account I had sworn on my wife's grave I would never touch. I want you to understand what that does to a person, because it is the cruelest moment in the whole confidence trade. It is not anger you feel first. It is vertigo, the floor tipping under you, because some part of you still wants it to be real so badly that it argues out loud with the part of you that knows. I went to the bank. I wired the $11,000. The teller was young enough to be my granddaughter, and she asked me twice if I was sure. I told her yes, and I want to be honest about what I knew and did not know in that moment, because the easy version of this story is a lie. I did not walk in there with a plan. I was not a clever man springing a clever trap. I was a grieving old fool spending his wife's headstone money on a ghost, and the small voice in me that knew better had been drowned out by the louder voice that simply could not stand to lose one more thing I loved. There had been a flicker, that morning, reading her message, a single line that had snagged on something, the way a sleeve snags on a nail. But grief had pulled me right past it. I signed the wire. I drove home to the quiet. It was that night, lying awake, that the snag finally tore. The line that had caught at me that morning came floating back up out of the dark. Claire had written, "I have no one else in this world I can turn to, and I would not ask if there were any other way." I had read that sentence before. Not something like it. That sentence, word for word, comma for comma. I had read it 3 years before I retired. In a binder a younger colleague passed around at a fraud conference, a binder of scam scripts seized from a raided call center on the far side of the world. Pages the operators there were made to read aloud, ranked and rated by how much money each line pulled loose. I have no one else in this world I can turn to, and I would not ask if there were any other way. And in the margin beside it, in another hand, a number. A conversion rate. It was a top performer. In the cold arithmetic of that place, it was one of the most effective sentences ever composed for separating a grieving person from their savings. And there it was, glowing on my screen, signed with a name I had let myself half love. That was the moment the grief fog lifted and 40 years stood up in the dark and stretched, because that one stolen sentence told me everything. It told me Claire was not a woman who had wandered into my life. Claire was a script. There was no single person behind her at all. There was a building somewhere, rows of people at keyboards, each one running a dozen lonely souls like me at the same time, all of us being read the very same lines, all of us feeding the same machine. The warmth I had been buying by the gift card was mass-produced on an assembly line. I sat up the rest of that night, and somewhere before dawn I made a decision that I want you to understand clearly, because it is the opposite of what every instinct in your body will scream at you to do. I decided not to confront her. That is the single most important thing I can teach you in this entire story, so I am going to say it plainly. The instant you confront them, they vanish. The account closes, the number goes dead, the persona evaporates into thin air, and they simply reach into the stack and pull out the next lonely person and begin again, and you are left with nothing but your shame and an empty bank account. Rage feels like justice. But rage is exactly the thing they are counting on. It makes you loud and sloppy and easy to disappear from. So I would not give them my rage. I would give them something they wanted far more. I would give them a customer who appeared to be cracking open even wider. But to do that, I needed help, and I needed it to be legal, and I needed it to be fast. That night I did not message Claire. I called a man named Harold. Harold and I came up together in the same fraud unit 30 years ago. 2 young men learning to read ledgers in a windowless room. He had spent his whole career on the financial side of this work, and though we were both retired now, the people we had trained were not. I told him everything. The dogwoods, the gift cards, the stolen sentence, the 11,000. I did not leave out the shame, because Harold would have heard the lie in my voice if I had, and because a man cannot ask for help with a sanded-down version of his own story. Harold did not laugh at me. He said something I have carried with me since. He said, "Walter, the ones who fall hardest are almost always the ones who loved hardest. That is not a flaw in you. That is just the bill that comes due for being a person worth conning in the first place." Then he got practical. He told me to file that very night with the federal center that tracks these crimes, the one that takes complaints at ic3.gov, and to do it fast, while the 11,000 was still moving. Speed, he said, was everything. There is a mechanism the recovery team uses, the financial fraud kill chain, where they coordinate with the banks and the field offices to freeze a fraudulent transfer before the money can be pulled out the far end. It is not magic, and it does not always work. The faster you report, the better your odds. And here's the part almost no one knows. For years, that tool was used mostly on enormous corporate wire frauds, but it can be initiated for romance scams too. For ordinary people. For grieving widowers. We are exactly who it was built to protect, and almost none of us ever report in time because almost all of us are too ashamed to report at all. I filed that night. Every detail, every account number, every screenshot, the stolen sentence, the margin note I still remembered. And then Harold and I built the second payment. This is the move. This is the whole thing. This is what 40 years buys a man. The next morning, I let Claire find me cracked wide open. I told her the wire had gone through and that I was only glad I could help, and I asked her, with the eagerness of a man fully and finally hooked, whether there was anything else she needed, because I could not bear the thought of her frightened and alone in some foreign hospital. I baited the second ask, and of course it came, fast and hungry now that she believed the dam had broken another transfer, a larger one, to a different account this time, with a story about avoiding the hospital's paperwork. A different account. That was the gift I had been waiting for. Because that second account, the one they only reveal once they are certain you are landed, sits far closer to the real machinery. It is where they gather the money before the final hop out of the country. But I did not simply send to it. Here is the part I want you to remember, because it is small, and it is legal, and it is the difference between a victim and an investigator. I told Claire I was a careful old man, that I had been burned by a mistyped number once before, and that I needed her to send me the full account details again in writing and to confirm the exact amount back to me, so there could be no mistake. And she did. She typed it out herself, the account number, the name on it, the amount, all of it, in her own words, in writing a clean, dated, self-incriminating record handed to me freely that the fraud unit now had in their hands before a single dollar moved. Their greed is the one genuinely real thing about them, and it is the lever that turns every clever defense they have right back against them. Then I sent the payment. Not $11,000 more of Eleanor's money. That account was empty now, and Harold and I both knew it. We sent a controlled payment, structured and flagged, with the bank's fraud unit and the recovery team watching it travel in real time, built to do exactly one thing: land in that gathering account, confirm it was live and receiving, and trigger the freeze on everything sitting inside it before the operators could move it on. And that is the screen the federal people were watching over my shoulder. That is the second time I sent money to the man who robbed me. The scammer believed she was opening her hand for more. What she was actually doing was holding the door wide and pointing, in her own handwriting, at the exact room the investigators most wanted to find. Then came the waiting. And I have to tell you the truth about the waiting, because the movies lie about it. Nothing happened for 9 days. 9 days of silence on my end and chatter on hers, Claire growing warmer and more wounded by turns, sensing some change in me she could not name. 9 days of me saying goodnight to her exactly like always, because the trap only holds if the mouse never learns the cat is in the room. And on the fourth of those days, my stomach turned cold. A new message arrived under one of my old dogwood posts, a different name, a different face, and 3 lines in, she wrote the same sentence, word for word. The machine had already filed Claire's work away and reassigned me to a fresh operator, the way a factory moves a half-finished part down the line. I was not a person to them. I was a row in a spreadsheet, and the spreadsheet never sleeps. That should have hardened me. Instead, on the 7th night, something happened that broke my heart in a direction I did not see coming. Claire slipped. It was late, near midnight my time, which made it a strange and broken hour wherever she truly sat. The messages had been off all evening, the rhythm gone, the practiced warmth worn thin. And then, dropped between 2 scripted lines, came something that belonged to no binder on earth. She wrote, "Do you ever wish you could just stop? Just stop and go home and have it all be over." No punctuation where the script would have placed it. No ask attached to the end of it. just that. I had spent 2 weeks knowing for a fact that Claire was a fiction. But fiction does not get tired at midnight. Fiction does not wish it could go home. I am going to say the next part as plainly as I know how, because it took me far too long to understand it, and I do not want it to take you as long. The woman I thought I had been falling in love with did not exist. But the person typing her did. And that person was not the predator I had been picturing all along. Somewhere in a building I would later learn sat inside a compound across an ocean, one of those places these operations run, where people are lured in with the promise of an honest job and then have their passports taken and are made to work the scripts under guard. Somewhere in a room like that sat a human being who had been trafficked into typing the very sentences I had read in that seized binder. Those conversion rates penciled in the margins were not only measuring how well the lines worked on victims like me. They were measuring whether the person reading them got fed that day. That midnight message was not part of any script. It was a real and exhausted person, worn past the point of performance, reaching through the one small window she had to a stranger she had been ordered to rob, asking him whether the wanting to go home ever stops. The man I had set out to hunt was not the woman on my screen. He was the man standing behind her chair. That realization rearranged everything I thought this story was. I had filed my report to catch a thief. I understood now that I was pulling on a single thread that ran straight through a room full of captives all the way back to the men who held the keys. The $11,000 had stopped being the point a long time ago. The point was the building. On the 10th day, the freeze came. Harold called me in the morning. The controlled payment had done exactly what we built it to do. The gathering account, the second one Claire had typed out for me in her own words, was frozen, with funds still sitting inside it. Not my money. My money had been gone since the first night. But a pool of other people's. Other lonely mornings. Other headstone accounts. All of it stopped mid-flight, one step short of the final hop overseas. And a frozen account is so much more than recovered money. A frozen account is a name. A name is a bank record. A bank record is a money mule, and a money mule, leaned on properly, is a path leading inward. I am not going to pretend it ended the way these things end in the movies, because it did not. And a story that lies to you at the finish does you no favors. Let me tell you what became of each of them, not all in one breath. Because real justice does not arrive in one breath either. The first was the simplest. The domestic account, the mule, the local hand who had agreed to let stolen money flow through their bank for a cut of it, was frozen, and then it was charged. A person who knew or who worked very hard at not knowing where that money came from. The law reached that one fully, and that one answered for it. And then, for a long while, nothing. Which brings me back to the granite. The $11,000 did not come back. I need you to hear that plainly, because it is the truth, and the truth is the only thing of any value I have to give you here. Money that leaves on a wire to a criminal is, almost always, money you never see again, no matter how clever you are, no matter how fast you move. The freeze recovered other people's money that was still in flight. Mine was long gone. That was the price I paid, with my eyes open, to find the door into that building. And I will tell you before I am finished that I would pay it again. But there is a thing about a man who spent 40 years in courtrooms in service of other people. A little of that tends to find its way back to him. When Harold told the story quietly in the right rooms of a retired fraud investigator who let himself be taken a second time on purpose to crack open a trafficking-funded scam ring, something happened that I never once asked for. A monument company 2 towns over, run by the son of a man I had helped a long time ago, heard about Eleanor's headstone. They would not take my money. They cut the granite themselves. And in the corner, exactly where I had drawn it on the folded paper in my wallet, they carved a dogwood. 4 petals. Each one notched at the tip, like something had taken a small, careful bite. I drove out on the first warm Sunday of spring. I set the receipt with Eleanor's own blue pen sketch against the base of the new stone, the real stone, and I sat down with her in the gravel the way we used to sit by the fence line. I did not gloat. There was no one to gloat to, and gloating was never what any of this was for. I just sat with my wife, and the dogwoods along the county road were blooming, white and notched and exactly as she had always seen them, and for the first time since that Tuesday in February, the quiet did not feel like something that had been done to me. It felt like hers. It felt like peace. The rest of the accounting came in slowly, the way the real kind always does, long after I had stopped checking the news for it. The handler above the mule, the mid-level link who recruited the accounts and ran them on this side of the ocean, was harder. But the frozen account had handed the investigators the records, and they mapped it the slow way, the real way, transfer by transfer, subpoena by subpoena, until they could put a name and a face to the man one rung up. That did not happen in a night. It happened months later. But it happened. The men inside the compound, the ones who held the passports and the keys and stood behind the chairs, those are the hardest of all, and I will not insult you by pretending they were all marched out in handcuffs the following week. Some of those operations sit in places the law has a hard time reaching at all, but a single frozen account does not stay a single account. The center that took my report stitches it to 100 others, and the picture of the building grows sharper, and the pressure builds, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes a compound gets raided, and a room full of captives gets walked out into the daylight. Months on, through a contact of Harold's who follows these things, I learned that the network Claire's account had fed into was among several disrupted in exactly that kind of operation. Which leaves the last of them. The one who was never my antagonist at all. I never learned her real name. I never saw her real face. But I told the investigators about the midnight message, every word of it, and I told them what I believed it meant, that the person at that keyboard was not a perpetrator, but a victim wearing a perpetrator's script. I do not know whether it mattered. I would like to believe that when the daylight finally came, she was one of the ones walked out into it. I have no way on this earth to be certain, but I think about the dogwood I described to Claire, the flower she claimed she wanted to plant to feel closer to my Eleanor, and I let myself believe that somewhere a frightened young woman who was forced to turn that flower into a weapon against me will one day stand in front of a real dogwood, free, on the first warm Sunday of some spring, and never have to read another line to anyone as long as she lives. I have to believe that one. The alternative is more than I can carry. I have thought a long while about what I would want you to take from all this, since most of you watching are nearer to my age than to that young teller's, and some of you are sitting tonight in a house that has gone too quiet, and some of you I know would have a Claire of your own typing good night to you at this very moment. So here is the wisdom, such as it is, bought at the price of $11,000 and a year of my pride. The con does not work because you are foolish. It works because you are loving, and you are lonely, and neither of those is a weakness. They are the proof that you are still a person worth being. The shame you feel is the scammer's final weapon, the one they leave buried inside you so that you will never report it and never tell a living soul. Put it down. The fastest hands in the world cannot beat a phone call made in time. Report it the same day to your bank and to that center at ic3.gov before the shame can talk you back out of it. You will not always get the money back, but you may freeze the next account, and the next account is somebody else's headstone money and somebody else's quiet house. The man behind the keyboard is forever counting on your silence. So do not. Whatever else you do, hand it to him. What would you have done the morning a stranger spoke your dead wife's name to pry open the account you had set aside for her grave? Tell me below, and tell me your age while you are at it, because I suspect the answer changes a great deal depending on how many quiet houses a person has already had to live through. I will leave you with this, because the thread does not end with me. Harold called again last month. About a woman 3 towns over. A widow. For nearly 2 years now, she has been sending her late husband's pension, a little every month, to a man who calls himself Daniel. A man who has promised her they will be married the very day his contract overseas finally ends. She does not know yet. And the part of it that keeps me awake is that the account Daniel's money flows into shares a pattern with one I have seen before. So last week, I made a phone call of my own. And the first warm Sunday of this coming spring, I am going to drive 3 towns over and knock on a stranger's door and ask her, very gently, whether she has ever once sketched the flower her husband loved. But that is a story for next time.